The doors of Luciano's swung open, letting in a blast of cold evening air along with Elena Blackwood. At 43, Elena had built her tech empire from scratch, turning a small app development company into a global powerhouse worth billions. Tonight, her sharp gray suit matched her mood as she entered the upscale Italian restaurant known for its soft lighting, old-world charm, and celebrity guests. The maitre d', a tall man named Paul with 20 years of experience handling elite clientele, recognized her instantly. His professional smile stayed fixed, but a flicker of worry crossed his eyes. "Ms. Blackwood," he said, stepping forward with practiced grace. "What a pleasure. Your usual table is ready." Elena barely nodded in response. She handed off her designer coat without looking at him, her attention already on her phone. Bad day, Paul wondered. Not that good days made much difference to how she treated the staff. Word of Elena's arrival spread through the restaurant like a silent alarm. Lisa, who had been Elena's server twice before and still remembered the cutting remarks about her inadequate wine knowledge, suddenly found urgent business in the kitchen. Carlos, a busboy who'd been yelled at last month for clearing a plate too early, shifted to tables in the far corner. "She's back," whispered Diane, the head waitress, to the newer staff members. "Whatever you do, don't mention the chef's special unless she asks. Last time someone suggested it, she said they were treating her like she couldn't read a menu herself." Elena's reputation wasn't just about money or power. Plenty of wealthy people ate at Luciano's without causing such anxiety. It was her cutting remarks, her impatience, her habit of writing brutal online reviews that could hurt a server's career. 3 months ago, she'd gotten a waiter, transferred to lunch shift, a major pay cut because he'd refilled her water glass too frequently, and hovered. As she was led to her corner table with the best view of the garden, Elena noticed the slight stiffening of shoulders as she passed. The way conversations dimmed then resumed once she was beyond earshot. She saw it all and chose to believe it was respect rather than fear. After all, respect was what she'd fought for all these years. Across the restaurant, at a table near the windows overlooking the small courtyard with its twinkling lights, Michael Foster helped his 10-year-old daughter Sophie twirl spaghetti onto her fork. "Remember, sweetie, twist it against the spoon like this," he demonstrated, his patient hands guiding hers. Sophie's face scrunched in concentration, her tongue poking slightly from the corner of her mouth. "Like this, Dad?" "Perfect." Michael beamed with the same pride he'd feel if she'd solved a complex math problem. In many ways, to him, these small victories were just as important. Michael, 36 and with tired eyes that still managed to crinkle warmly when he smiled, had been raising Sophie alone since his wife Beth died from cancer 5 years ago. He taught high school science at the local public school, where his experiments and enthusiasm made him a student favorite despite the challenging subject. These monthly fancy dinners had started as a way to maintain some normalcy after Beth's death. Now they were a treasured tradition. Michael saved carefully each month to afford these evenings at Luciano's, choosing to give Sophie experiences rather than things when he could. "Dad, look at that lady's shoes," Sophie whispered, nodding subtly toward Elena. "They look like they hurt." Michael glanced over, noting the razor-sharp stilettos. "Some people choose style over comfort," he said with a small smile. "Not me," Sophie declared, swinging her sneaker-clad feet under the table. "I'm going to invent shoes that look cool and feel good when I grow up. That's my practical girl," Michael laughed, taking a sip of his one glass of house wine. He'd learned to stretch these moments to savor the simple pleasure of sitting across from his daughter in a nice place, watching her experience new things. Their waiter, Tom, approached their table with a basket of fresh bread. "How's the spaghetti, young lady?" he asked Sophie with genuine interest. "So good. Way better than the kind from a box," Sophie replied enthusiastically. Tom had served them before and remembered Michael's unpretentious questions about the menu and generous tip, despite his obvious budget constraints. He genuinely enjoyed waiting on them, especially seeing Sophie's delight in the fancy experience. "Anything else I can bring you to?" Tom asked. "We're great, thank you," Michael replied. As Tom moved away, Michael noticed him taking a circuitous route that specifically avoided Elena Blackwood's table, where another server was carefully placing a glass of wine before her. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversation and the gentle clink of silverware. Through the kitchen doors, glimpses of controlled chaos could be seen as Chef Antonio directed his team with passionate Italian gestures. The smell of garlic, fresh basil, and tomato sauce filled the air, mingling with the scent of baking bread and grilled seafood. Elena sat alone, scrolling through her phone as she waited for her appetizer. Her day had been filled with frustrations. A major acquisition deal had fallen through at the last minute, when the startup she wanted changed their minds. Her assistant had scheduled a critical meeting for the wrong time. The traffic had been unexpectedly heavy. Each small irritation had built upon the last until she arrived at Luciano's with a storm cloud practically visible above her head. She came here often, appreciating the quality of food if not the company. Dining alone was a choice. Meetings disguised as dinners were for people who couldn't separate business from pleasure. "Your burrata." "Ms. Blackwood," said a nervous young server named Ryan, carefully placing the plate before her. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged her silverware just so, painfully aware of her reputation. Elena looked up from her phone, her sharp eyes taking in the presentation of the dish. The creamy cheese, the heirloom tomatoes, the drizzle of aged balsamic. She said nothing, which Ryan took as a win as he backed away from the table. Across the room, Sophie's laughter rang out at something her father said, the sound genuine and free in a way that drew smiles from nearby tables. Even Elena glanced over, momentarily distracted from her thoughts by the sound. Michael was telling Sophie about his chemistry class's failed experiment that day, acting out how the foam had unexpectedly expanded all over his desk while his students howled with laughter. And then Tommy said, "Mr. Foster, I think science is attacking you." Michael recounted, his expression so comical that Sophie dissolved into giggles again. Their easy relationship was visible to anyone watching, the way they leaned toward each other when speaking, their shared glances at the dessert cart that had just rolled by, the gentle corrections when Sophie accidentally knocked over her water glass and Michael quickly helped her mop it up, without a hint of anger. Elena found herself watching them longer than she'd intended. Something about their interaction nagged at her, though she couldn't quite place what. She turned back to her phone, dismissing the thought. The restaurant staff continued their careful dance around her table. The manager, Alex, stopped by briefly to ensure everything was to her satisfaction, his professional demeanor hiding his anxiety. One bad review from Elena Blackwood could affect their ratings for months. She was known for her detailed cutting critiques that somehow always rose to the top of review sites. "Everything is acceptable," Elena replied, which from her was practically effusive praise. As the evening progressed, more diners filled the restaurant. A famous actor and his wife were seated in the far corner, causing a subtle ripple of recognition through the room, though the staff were too professional to make a fuss. A group of business people celebrating a deal took the large round table in the center, their laughter growing louder with each bottle of champagne. Through it all, the contrast between Elena's isolated, tense bubble and Michael and Sophie's warm, connected dinner experience grew more pronounced. One represented power without joy, the other, joy without power. Neither Michael nor Elena realized that this ordinary evening at Luciano's would become the setting for an unexpected confrontation that would change both their lives. For now, they were simply two strangers sharing the same space, unaware of each other's stories, unaware of what was to come. The stage was set, the players were in position, and somewhere in the kitchen, a nervous new server named Marco was being told it was his turn to approach the dreaded table of Elena Blackwood, setting in motion events that none of them could foresee. Elena stared at her appetizer with narrowed eyes. The burrata looked perfect, creamy white cheese against vibrant tomatoes, but she picked up her fork and prodded it suspiciously. Something about it didn't seem right to her. Maybe it was her mood, or maybe it was her need to find flaws where others saw none. Either way, she was determined to be disappointed. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice cutting through the gentle murmur of the restaurant. Several servers looked up, their faces showing the same expression. "Please don't let her be calling me." Ryan, the young server who had brought the dish, took a deep breath and approached her table. "Yes, Miss Blackwood? Is there something wrong with your appetizer?" "This cheese is too cold," Elena said flatly. "It should be served at room temperature. Any decent restaurant knows this." She pushed the plate away as if offended by its presence. "Take it back." "I'm so sorry, Miss Blackwood. I'll bring you a new one right away," Ryan said, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. This was his 3rd month at Luciano's, and he'd heard plenty of stories about Elena. Now he was living one. In the kitchen, Chef Antonio received the returned dish with a frown. He touched the cheese with the back of his knuckle. "Perfetto," he muttered. "It is perfect temperature." But he knew better than to argue. Elena Blackwood had sent back perfectly good dishes before, and she would do it again. He prepared a fresh plate, letting it sit for precisely 7 minutes, just enough time to make her believe something had changed, but not enough to affect the quality. At their table by the window, Michael noticed the small commotion. Sophie was busy arranging her napkin into the shape of a bird, something she'd learned from a YouTube video, but Michael watched as the server carried away the barely touched appetizer. "Everything okay with your meal, Mr. Foster?" Tom asked as he refilled their water glasses. "Everything's wonderful," Michael replied. Then, lowering his voice slightly, he nodded toward Elena's table. "Seems like someone's having a rough night." Tom's smile tightened. "Ms. Blackwood is one of our more particular customers. Dad, look. I made a swan," Sophie interrupted, proudly holding up her napkin creation. "That's amazing, sweetheart. You're getting so good at those," Michael said, his attention immediately back on his daughter. "Maybe you could teach me how to make one someday." Sophie beamed. "It's easy. You just need to be patient and follow the steps." Patience and following steps. Sounds like good advice for lots of things in life, Michael said with a wink. Ryan returned to Elena's table with the new burrata. "Here you are, Ms. Blackwood. Chef Antonio prepared this fresh for you." Elena didn't thank him. She merely nodded and picked up her fork again. Ryan retreated quickly, nearly bumping into a busboy in his haste to escape her orbit. The main courses began to arrive around the restaurant. The famous actor in the corner received his mushroom risotto with a discreet smile from the server. The business group's steaks and pastas were presented with flourish. Michael and Sophie's shared plate of gnocchi was placed between them, along with a side of roasted vegetables. "Remember the time Mom tried to make gnocchi at home?" Sophie asked suddenly, her eyes bright with the memory. Michael smiled, though there was a touch of sadness in it. "How could I forget?" The kitchen looked like it had been hit by a flour bomb. "But it tasted good," Sophie said firmly. "Different than this, but still good." "Your mom could make anything taste good," Michael agreed. "She just couldn't do it without turning the kitchen upside down." They shared a moment of quiet remembrance, then Sophie dug into the gnocchi with enthusiasm. "These are like little pillows." Across the restaurant, Elena's main course arrived, a delicate sea bass with lemon and capers. She examined it critically, then took a small bite. The server, a veteran named David who had been specifically assigned to her main course because of his thick skin and calm demeanor, waited at a respectful distance. "The fish is overcooked," Elena declared, putting down her fork after just 2 bites. David's expression didn't change. "I'm very sorry to hear that, Ms. Blackwood. Would you like Chef Antonio to prepare you something else?" Elena sighed dramatically. "Fine, tell him I'll have the risotto instead. And make sure it's properly done this time." David nodded and retreated to the kitchen. Behind the swinging doors, he rolled his eyes at Chef Antonio. "Fish is overcooked," he said, making air quotes. "She wants the risotto now." Chef Antonio pressed his lips together. He had cooked that fish perfectly, and they both knew it. But he also knew that arguing with Elena Blackwood was bad for business. "Risotto coming up," he said, turning to his stove. Back in the dining room, the staff had developed a subtle rotation system around Elena's table. Diane, the head waitress, was coordinating it all with small gestures and whispered instructions. "Linda, you take water duty for Ms. Blackwood this round. David's handling the main course drama. Ryan, you're off the hook. Go help table 12. Pedro, be ready for dessert duty. Remember, quick and professional. No chit-chat unless she initiates." The waitstaff moved like dancers avoiding a hole in the stage. New servers were steered clear of Elena's table entirely. When one trainee named Jill started to approach with a water pitcher, Diane smoothly intercepted her with a hand on the arm and a tiny shake of the head. "But her glass is empty," Jill whispered, confused. "Linda will handle it," Diane replied under her breath. "Trust me, you don't want your first week to include an encounter with Ms. Blackwood." The pattern wasn't lost on Michael. As a high school science teacher, he was used to watching group dynamics. The way the staff moved around the restaurant told a clear story. They were protecting themselves and each other from the woman in the corner. Why do the waiters keep looking at that lady like she's a lion? Sophie asked suddenly. Kids had a way of cutting straight to the truth. Michael considered his answer carefully. I think she might be someone who's hard to please, he said. And they're worried about making her upset. But it's just dinner, Sophie said, her brow furrowed. Why would anyone get so upset about dinner? Sometimes people carry their bad day with them wherever they go, Michael explained. And sometimes people with a lot of money or power forget how to be kind to people with less. That's silly, Sophie declared. Being rich doesn't mean you should be mean. You're absolutely right, Michael agreed. In fact, I think having more should make you more understanding, not less. That's what I try to teach my students, that success should make you kinder, not crueler. Across the room, Elena's risotto arrived. She tasted it and, finding no immediate fault, began to eat in silence, still scrolling through her phone. David relaxed slightly but kept a careful eye on her table. The evening continued. Dessert carts rolled by. Coffee was served. The business group got louder as they ordered another round of drinks. Through it all, the invisible dance around Elena's table continued, a masterclass in avoidance and damage control. When it came time for dessert, Sophie's eyes widened at the chocolate cake being wheeled past on the cart. Can we share one, Dad, please? Michael checked his wallet discreetly. He had budgeted for this dinner carefully and dessert would push him slightly over, but the look on Sophie's face made the decision easy. Of course we can. Life's too short to skip chocolate cake. They ordered one slice with 2 forks, and Sophie's delight when it arrived was worth every penny. Michael watched her take her first bite, her eyes closing in bliss, and felt a rush of love so strong it almost hurt. Meanwhile, Elena declined dessert but ordered an espresso. When it arrived, she frowned at the cup. This is not hot enough, she said to Pedro, the server who had drawn the short straw for dessert duty. Pedro, a college student working at Luciano's to pay his tuition, felt his face flush. I'm sorry, Ms. Blackwood, I'll bring you a fresh one right away. And make sure it's properly hot this time, she added, her tone making it clear she found the whole situation tedious and the staff incompetent. As Pedro hurried away with the rejected espresso, he passed Michael and Sophie's table. Sophie looked up from her chocolate cake and gave him a sympathetic smile. Pedro couldn't help but smile back, grateful for the small moment of kindness in an otherwise stressful evening. Michael noticed the exchange and felt proud of his daughter's natural empathy. He was raising her right despite everything. Beth would be proud too. The contrast between the two tables couldn't have been more stark. One radiating warmth and appreciation, the other cold dismissal and criticism. As the night wore on, the stage was being set for an unexpected confrontation that would change the atmosphere of Luciano's forever. The dessert plates were being cleared around the restaurant. The famous actor and his wife had left quietly through the back door, a courtesy arranged by the management. The business group had finally settled their bill, with much backslapping and handshaking before they departed. A peaceful lull settled over Luciano's as the evening wound down. At their window table, Michael glanced at his watch. Almost time to head home, kiddo. School night. Sophie nodded reluctantly, using her finger to gather the last smudges of chocolate from her plate. This was the best one yet, Dad. The best what? Dessert. No, the best special dinner, Sophie clarified. Even better than last month when that guy was playing the violin. Michael smiled, warmed by her simple joy. I'm glad. These nights are special to me too. What he didn't say was how these dinners anchored him, gave him something to look forward to during long weeks of grading papers and stretching his teacher's salary. Seeing Sophie happy in this grown-up setting, learning how to navigate the world of cloth napkins and multiple forks. It mattered to him in ways he couldn't fully explain. Across the restaurant, Elena checked her watch impatiently. Her espresso had finally met her standards, but now she was ready for the check. She caught Diane's eye and made a small signing motion with her hand. Diane nodded and headed to the computer to print Elena's bill. Just then, Alex the manager approached Elena's table with a nervous-looking young man beside him. The young man was barely 20, with dark hair that flopped over his forehead and hands that he couldn't seem to keep still. Ms. Blackwood, Alex said smoothly. I wanted to introduce Marco. He's just joined our team and he'll be one of our regular evening servers. I thought you might like to meet him as one of our most valued customers. It was a gamble, Alex knew. Elena rarely showed interest in the staff beyond criticizing them, but Marco needed the experience with all types of customers and Alex couldn't shield him forever. Elena gave Marco a cursory glance. "Fine," she said dismissively. "He can bring me my check." Alex nodded to Marco, who stepped forward with the leather folder containing Elena's bill. "Here you are, Ms. Blackwood," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "Thank you for dining with us tonight." As Marco set down the check, his elbow brushed against Elena's half-full wine glass. The crystal teetered for a heart-stopping moment before tipping over, sending a splash of deep red Cabernet across the white tablecloth and onto the sleeve of Elena's expensive gray suit. The restaurant seemed to freeze. Diane, watching from near the kitchen doors, closed her eyes briefly as if in pain. Alex's professional smile vanished, replaced by genuine alarm, and Marco stood paralyzed, horror etched on his young face. I'm so sorry," he stammered, grabbing a napkin and reaching toward the spreading stain on Elena's sleeve. Elena jerked her arm away as if his touch might burn her. Her face, always composed even in displeasure, now contorted with genuine anger. "Don't touch me," she snapped. "Ms. Blackwood, I'm so sorry." Alex jumped in, motioning for more napkins. "We'll take care of the cleaning bill for your suit, of course." Elena ignored him, her eyes locked on Marco's trembling form. "Incompetent," she said, her voice rising. "Completely incompetent. Do you have any idea what this suit costs? More than you'll make in 3 months at this job." Marco's face flushed deep red. "It was an accident, ma'am." "I'm very sorry. An accident." Elena stood now, her voice carrying across the restaurant. "An accident is what happens when someone qualified makes a rare mistake. This is what happens when you hire people who clearly don't belong in a place like this." The remaining diners had gone quiet, uncomfortably witnessing the scene unfolding. The staff froze in place, dishes and drinks momentarily forgotten in their hands. "Do you know who I am?" Elena continued, her voice cutting through the silence. "I could buy this entire restaurant with what I spent on lunch yesterday. I could have everyone in here fired with one phone call." Marco seemed to shrink with each word, his shoulders hunching as if trying to make himself a smaller target. "I'm sorry," he repeated, his voice barely audible. "Sorry doesn't clean my suit. Sorry doesn't undo your incompetence." Elena turned to Alex, dismissing Marco entirely. "I want him fired now, not tomorrow, not next week, now." Alex swallowed hard. "Ms. Blackwood, I understand you're upset. I assure you we'll handle this situation." "Fired," Elena repeated, cutting him off. "Or I'll make sure everyone in the city knows that Luciano's thinks it's acceptable to ruin their customers' clothing and then do nothing about it." The threat hung in the air. A bad review from a random diner was one thing. A public complaint from Elena Blackwood, with her millions of social media followers and connections throughout the city's elite, that could damage Luciano's reputation in ways that might take years to repair. At their table, Michael had been watching the situation unfold with growing discomfort. When the wine spilled, he'd instinctively moved to help before realizing it wasn't his place. Now, as Elena's tirade continued, he found himself thinking of his students. How many bright, hard-working kids he'd seen crushed by public humiliation. How long it took them to recover their confidence afterward. "Dad," Sophie whispered, her eyes wide as she watched the scene. "That lady is being really mean." Michael nodded, his jaw tight. "Yes, she is. Why doesn't anyone stop her?" Sophie asked, the simple question hanging between them. Why indeed? Michael thought. Because the woman was rich? Because she had power? Because standing up to people like that often came with consequences? All true, but hardly explanations he wanted to give his 10-year-old daughter. Sometimes people are afraid to stand up to someone who seems powerful, Michael said quietly. Even when they know that person is wrong, Sophie frowned. But you always tell me to stand up for people even when it's hard. Michael felt something shift inside him at his daughter's words. She was right. He taught her and his students about courage and kindness, about standing up for what was right, especially when it was difficult. And here he sat, watching a young man being publicly humiliated, doing nothing. What kind of example was he setting? Across the room, Marco was blinking rapidly, clearly fighting back tears. Michael recognized the look from his classroom, the desperate effort to maintain dignity while being torn apart, the struggle not to cry in front of others. It was just a simple mistake, Marco was saying, his voice steadier now despite his obvious distress. I'm working this job to help with my mom's medical bills. Please, I really need this job. Elena's laugh was sharp and without humor. That's not my problem. Your mother's bills are not my concern. Your incompetence, however, is, at least as long as I'm sitting in this restaurant. She turned to Alex again. Well, are you going to handle this properly, or do I need to call the owner directly? Lawrence and I play golf, you know. Alex looked torn, glancing between Elena and Marco, weighing the reputation of the restaurant against the young man's plea. The rest of the staff watched in painful silence, helpless to intervene. At his table, Michael felt Sophie's eyes on him. She wasn't just watching Elena and Marco now. She was watching her father, waiting to see what he would do, whether he would live up to the values he'd been teaching her all these years. Tom approached their table with the check, his expression apologetic. Sorry about all this, he said quietly to Michael. Not exactly the peaceful dinner you were hoping for, I'm sure. Michael signed the credit card slip, adding a generous tip as always, but his eyes remained on the scene across the restaurant. Marco now stood with his head bowed as Elena continued her demands for his termination. The young man's hands were clasped behind his back, knuckles white with tension. Dad, Sophie whispered again, her small hand tugging at his sleeve. That boy looks so sad, like Tyler did when the big kids took his science project last year. Tyler. Michael remembered the incident well. A shy 7th grader whose carefully constructed solar system model had been knocked over by 8th grade boys, who then laughed as Tyler tried not to cry while gathering the broken planets. Michael had stepped in then, not just disciplining the older boys but using the moment to teach about empathy and respect. Where was that teacher now? Where was the man who'd taught hundreds of students about standing up for what was right? Michael looked at Sophie's concerned face, then back at Marco, still enduring Elena's verbal assault. He thought about the lessons he wanted his daughter to learn, not just from his words, but from his actions. Excuse me for a minute, sweetheart, Michael said, rising from his chair. Sometimes we have to stand up for people, even when it's hard. Sophie's eyes widened as she realized what her father was about to do. Be careful, Dad, she whispered, pride and worry mingling in her voice. Michael straightened his shoulders, took a deep breath, and walked toward Elena Blackwood's table. The restaurant had fallen into an uncomfortable silence. The few remaining diners pretended to focus on their meals, but their eyes kept drifting toward the scene unfolding at Elena's table. The staff had frozen in place. Waiters paused mid-step, busboys clutching dirty dishes, bartenders halting mid-pour. Michael walked across the restaurant with measured steps. Not rushing, not hesitant. He could feel his heart pounding, but his face remained calm. Years of standing before classrooms of teenagers had taught him the value of appearing confident even when you weren't. Elena was still lecturing Alex about Marco's incompetence when she noticed Michael approaching. She paused mid-sentence, annoyance flashing across her face at the interruption. Excuse me, Michael said, his voice quiet but clear. Alex turned, surprised. Marco looked up, confusion mixing with the humiliation on his young face. This doesn't concern you, Elena said dismissively, barely glancing at Michael. This is between me and the management. Michael nodded, acknowledging her words but not retreating. I understand. I couldn't help overhearing what happened, and I thought I might offer a different perspective. Something in his calm tone made Elena pause. Most people either cowered before her anger or matched it with their own. This man did neither. She studied him more carefully. His department store suit that had seen better days, his simple watch, his kind eyes that held no hint of intimidation. And who exactly are you? She asked, her voice sharp with impatience. I'm Michael Foster. I teach high school science at Westridge Public. He smiled slightly. Nothing fancy, but I've spent 15 years working with young people, and I've seen what public humiliation can do. Elena's eyebrows rose. Am I supposed to care about your teaching career? This young man ruined my designer suit and needs to face consequences. Michael nodded again. I understand you're upset about your suit. That makes perfect sense. His agreement seemed to catch Elena off guard. I'd be upset too if something I valued was damaged. He glanced at Marco, who was staring at him with a mixture of confusion and hope. But I've seen what happens when we shame people for honest mistakes. I've watched confident kids become afraid to raise their hands in class after one harsh comment. I've seen talented students give up on subjects they loved because they got laughed at for a wrong answer. Michael wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't pointing fingers or making demands. He was simply speaking truth as he knew it, with the same clear, thoughtful tone he used in his classroom. This young man made a mistake, Michael continued. One that many experienced servers have probably made at some point in their careers. The difference is they were likely given a chance to learn from it, rather than being publicly shamed and fired on the spot. Elena's mouth tightened. You have no idea who you're talking to. You're right, Michael agreed. I don't know you, just as you don't know this young man, or what firing him would mean for his life. He gestured toward Marco, who was watching the exchange with wide eyes. You don't know that he's working here to help with his mother's medical bills, as he mentioned. You don't know his dreams or his struggles. Michael took a breath. But I do know that we all make mistakes, even billionaires, I imagine. The question is whether those mistakes define us, or whether we're given the grace to learn and grow from them. From across the room, Sophie watched her father with wide eyes. She couldn't hear everything he was saying, but she could see that he was standing tall, speaking calmly, not backing down. I'm here with my daughter, Michael continued, nodding toward Sophie. She's 10, and she asked me why no one was standing up for that young man when he was being treated unfairly. I didn't have a good answer for her. For the first time, Elena glanced toward Sophie, who was watching them intently. Something flickered across Elena's face. Too quick to identify. So you're trying to teach your daughter some kind of moral lesson at my expense? Elena asked, but her voice had lost some of its edge. Michael shook his head. I'm trying to be the person I tell my daughter and my students to be. Someone who speaks up when they see injustice, even when it's uncomfortable. Someone who recognizes that we're all human, all capable of both mistakes and growth. He looked at the wine stain on Elena's sleeve. That suit can be cleaned, but the damage done when we strip away someone's dignity is much harder to repair. The restaurant remained silent. Alex stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene. Marco had stopped trembling, his eyes fixed on Michael with something like awe. Elena studied Michael for a long moment. You have a lot of nerve, she finally said, but the fury had drained from her voice. Do you always insert yourself into strangers' business? Not usually, Michael admitted with a small smile. I'm actually a pretty quiet person most of the time, but I tell my students that our character is defined by what we do when it's difficult, not when it's easy. He gestured to the room around them. Everyone here is having a hard night because of what happened. You're upset about your suit? This young man is afraid he'll lose his job. The staff is walking on eggshells. No one is enjoying their evening. For the first time, Elena seemed to notice the silent restaurant, the staring diners, the frozen staff. She was accustomed to people watching her, but usually with admiration or envy, not with this uncomfortable mixture of fear and disapproval. We all have bad days, Michael continued. We all carry burdens others can't see. I don't know what kind of day you've had, but I imagine running $1 billion company comes with a lot of stress that I can't begin to understand. Elena's expression flickered again. Her acquisition deal had fallen through that morning, costing her company millions. Her assistant had messed up her schedule, making her miss a critical meeting. And her father had called, as he did every month, to remind her that her success would never compensate for being the daughter who had failed to follow in his footsteps by becoming a doctor. But how could this stranger know any of that? I'm not asking you to ignore the wine spill, Michael said. I'm just suggesting that there might be a response that allows everyone to maintain their dignity. A response that might even turn this moment into something positive rather than something everyone here will remember with discomfort. Elena looked at the wine stain again, then at Marco, whose face was still flushed with embarrassment but who now stood a little straighter under Michael's defense. What's your name? She asked the young server directly. Marco Torres, ma'am, he answered, his voice steadier than before. How long have you been working here, Marco? This is my second week, Miss Blackwood. Elena nodded slowly. She looked back at Michael, who was waiting quietly, then at Sophie, still watching from across the room, then at the other diners and staff, all pretending not to stare while doing exactly that. Something shifted in Elena's expression, subtle but definite. A loosening around her eyes, a softening of her mouth. She straightened her shoulders and turned to Marco. Accidents happen, she said, her voice controlled but no longer cutting, especially during one's first weeks on a new job. The relief in the restaurant was almost audible, a collective exhale as the tension began to dissipate. Thank you. Ms. Blackwood, Marco said, genuine gratitude in his voice. I really am sorry about your suit. If there's anything I can do, it can be cleaned, Elena said, echoing Michael's earlier words. She turned to Alex. I assume Luciano's has a relationship with a good dry cleaner. Of course, Ms. Blackwood, Alex replied quickly. We'll take care of it immediately at our expense. Good. Elena's gaze returned to Michael. You're a science teacher? Yes, Michael nodded. At Westridge Public. Mostly chemistry and physics. Brave man, Elena said, the smallest hint of a smile touching her lips. I nearly failed chemistry in high school. It's not for everyone, Michael agreed. But when you see a student finally understand a difficult concept, that moment when it clicks, there's nothing quite like it. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the billionaire tech mogul and the public school teacher. An unlikely connection formed in the strangest of circumstances. Then Elena nodded, more to herself than to Michael. Well, I think I've taken up enough of everyone's evening. She turned to Marco. I hope your mother's health improves. Thank you. Ms. Blackwood, Marco said, surprise evident in his voice. Elena signed her bill, adding a tip that made Alex's eyes widen when he later processed the payment. Then she gathered her things and walked toward the exit, her posture perfect, her expression composed. But as she passed Michael, she paused briefly. Your daughter is fortunate, she said quietly, to have a father who lives by his principles. Before Michael could respond, Elena continued toward the door. The restaurant manager hurried to help her with her coat, relief written across his face. Michael returned to his table where Sophie was practically bouncing in her seat with excitement. Dad, you stood up to her just like you tell us to do at school. Michael smiled, feeling both drained and oddly energized by the confrontation. I tried, sweetheart. And she listened to you, Sophie said with wonder. She was so angry, but she actually listened. Sometimes people just need a gentle reminder of who they want to be, Michael said, gathering their things. Most people don't actually want to be unkind. They just forget sometimes, especially when they're having a hard day. As they prepared to leave, Marco approached their table, his earlier embarrassment replaced by quiet gratitude. Mr. Foster, I don't know how to thank you, he said. No one's ever stood up for me like that before. Michael shook his head. You don't need to thank me. Just remember how this felt someday when you see someone else in a similar situation. Marco nodded solemnly. I will, I promise. As Michael and Sophie walked out of Luciano's that night, neither could have guessed how this simple act of standing up for what was right would change all their lives in the weeks to come. 2 weeks passed. Life returned to its normal rhythm for Michael and Sophie. School days, homework at the kitchen table, weekend trips to the park, and the constant juggling act of single parenthood on a teacher's salary. Michael hadn't thought much about that night at Luciano's. In the grand scheme of things, lesson plans, parent conferences, Sophie's upcoming science fair, it was just one unusual evening that made for a good story to tell his fellow teachers during lunch break. On Friday afternoon, Michael was in his classroom after the final bell, sorting through a pile of chemistry tests. The school was quiet, most students having rushed home to start their weekend. Down the hall, the basketball team practiced, their squeaking shoes and occasional shouts echoing through the empty corridors. A knock on his classroom door made him look up. The school principal, Mrs. Chen, stood there with an unexpected expression on her face, something between excitement and disbelief. Michael, do you have a minute? She asked. There's someone here to see you. Before he could respond, a familiar figure appeared beside Mrs. Chen. Elena Blackwood, dressed in a simple but clearly expensive black blazer and pants, looked strangely out of place among the worn desks and faded educational posters about the periodic table. Ms. Blackwood, Michael said, rising from his chair in surprise. This is unexpected. Mrs. Chen looked between them with barely contained curiosity. You two know each other? We met briefly, Elena replied, her eyes taking in the classroom, the beakers lined up on the side counter, the molecular models hanging from the ceiling, the inspirational quotes written on the whiteboard in Michael's neat handwriting. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Not at all, Michael said, finding his composure. Just grading some tests. Mrs. Chen seemed to sense they might want privacy. I'll leave you to talk. Michael, just come find me before you leave. We should discuss the possibility. She departed with one last curious glance, leaving Michael alone with Elena. For a moment, neither spoke. "How did you find me?" Michael finally asked. "I have resources," Elena said with a small smile. "Finding one public school teacher isn't particularly challenging when you own a tech company that specializes in data." Michael gestured to a student desk. "Would you like to sit? I'm afraid my classroom chairs aren't as comfortable as the ones at Luciano's." "I've sat in worse," Elena said, perching on the offered chair that was clearly designed for someone much smaller. Another silence fell between them. Through the windows, the afternoon sun cast long rectangles of light across the linoleum floor. Somewhere in the distance, a school bus honked. "I wanted to thank you properly," Elena finally said. "For what?" Michael asked. "For reminding me of something I'd forgotten." She looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up at him. "I've been reflecting on my behavior that night, and on many other nights. It wasn't who I want to be." Michael nodded, sensing there was more. "I went back to Luciano's," Elena continued. "I apologized to the staff, properly." "I'm sure that meant a lot to them," Michael said, "especially to Marco." "Marco," Elena repeated the name thoughtfully. "He wasn't there, actually, but I left a note for him and—" She hesitated. "I arranged to cover his mother's medical bills through my foundation." Michael's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That's incredibly generous." Elena shook her head slightly. "It's the least I could do, but that's not why I came here today." She straightened in the too small chair. "I took a tour of your school on my way to your classroom." "A tour?" Michael asked, puzzled. "Your principal was very accommodating when I told her I was interested in potentially making a donation." A wry smile touched Elena's lips. "It's amazing how quickly doors open when people hear the word donation." "That's true," Michael agreed, still uncertain where this conversation was heading. "I saw your science lab," Elena said, her expression growing more serious. "Or what passes for one here." Michael winced slightly. The school's lab was outdated, to put it kindly. Equipment from the 1990s, not enough supplies for all students to do experiments simultaneously. Broken stools that the school couldn't afford to replace. "We make do with what we have," he said simply. Elena nodded. "Yes, I could see that. Very creative use of limited resources." She paused. "But students shouldn't have to make do when it comes to education, especially in science." She reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek tablet. With a few taps, she brought up what looked like architectural plans and turned the screen toward Michael. "What do you think?" she asked. Michael leaned forward to look at the drawings. It took him a moment to realize what he was seeing, a completely reimagined science lab with modern equipment, proper safety features, individual workstations, and a layout that would accommodate different types of learning. "This is," he began, but words failed him. "My foundation would like to fund this renovation," Elena said matter-of-factly, "along with updated equipment, materials, and ongoing support for special projects and competitions." Michael looked up from the tablet, stunned. "That would cost a significant amount," Elena finished for him. "Yes, but considerably less than what I spent on my home theater system last month." There was a touch of self-deprecation in her voice. Money that could be put to much better use. Michael's mind raced with the possibilities, what his students could learn, create, and discover with proper resources. The experiments they could conduct, the curiosity they could satisfy, the careers that might be born. "Why?" he finally asked. "Why our school? Why my lab?" Elena was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. 2 weeks ago, a public school teacher reminded me that success should make you kinder, not crueler. That we're defined by what we do when it's difficult, not when it's easy. She met his eyes directly. "I built my company from nothing. I fought for every opportunity. Somewhere along the way, I started to believe that gave me the right to treat others as less." She gestured around the classroom. "You're fighting too. For these kids. For their futures. With far fewer resources than I have at my disposal." A smile touched her lips. And you're doing it without making people fear you when you walk into a room. Outside in the hallway, the basketball players passed by laughing and talking loudly on their way to the locker rooms. Elena waited until their voices faded before continuing. There's one condition to the donation, she said. What's that? Michael asked, expecting some sort of publicity requirement or naming opportunity. That you'll have dinner with me again, Elena said, her usual confidence faltering slightly. Not at Luciano's, somewhere else, just the two of us. Michael blinked in surprise. Are you asking me on a date, Ms. Blackwood? Elena, she corrected him. And yes, I believe I am. Her expression was a mixture of determination and uncertainty that Michael found unexpectedly endearing. Unless that would be inappropriate given the donation, in which case the donation stands regardless of your answer. Michael considered her for a long moment. This was not how he had expected his Friday afternoon to unfold. The donation to... The school is incredibly generous, and I know our students would benefit enormously from it. Elena nodded, waiting for the rest of his response. As for dinner, Michael smiled. I'd like that, but I should warn you I can't afford the kinds of restaurants you're probably used to. I think I can manage the bill, Elena said, relief evident in her voice. Besides, I've been told I need to work on my people skills. Having dinner with a high school teacher who's not intimidated by me seems like a good place to start. They exchanged phone numbers, and Elena prepared to leave. At the classroom door, she paused. How's your daughter? Sophie, right? She's good, Michael said, touched that Elena remembered. Still talking about that chocolate cake from Luciano's. She seems like a remarkable kid, Elena said. You're doing a good job with her. I'm trying, Michael replied honestly. Every day, Elena nodded. That's all any of us can do. She glanced once more around the classroom. I'll have my foundation contact Mrs. Chen about the formal details of the donation. We should be able to start work on the lab this summer. Thank you, Michael said simply, not just for the donation, but for coming here personally, for being willing to. He searched for the right words. Change, Elena suggested. Grow? Admit I was wrong? Her smile was self-aware. All things I've traditionally been terrible at. It's never too late to learn new skills, Michael said with the optimism of a lifelong teacher. No, Elena agreed. It's not. When she was gone, Michael stood in his empty classroom, trying to process what had just happened. The possibility of a state-of-the-art lab for his students. The unexpected connection with a woman who had seemed so untouchable just 2 weeks ago. Before leaving for the day, Michael stopped by Sophie's classroom where she was finishing an art project in the after-school program. She looked up as he entered, her face brightening. Dad, look what I made. She held up a colorful painting of what appeared to be 2 people at a table with a chocolate cake between them. It's beautiful, Michael said, genuinely impressed. Is that us at Luciano's? Sophie nodded proudly. Yep. It's for the Everyday Heroes project. We're supposed to paint someone being brave in a normal situation. She pointed at the figure representing Michael, like when you stood up for that server even though that fancy lady was being so mean. Michael crouched beside her desk, studying the painting with a smile. The funny thing is that fancy lady came to visit me today. Sophie's eyes widened. Really? Was she still mean? No, Michael said, thinking of Elena's unexpected vulnerability, her genuine desire to make amends. She's actually trying really hard to be nice now. She wants to help our school build a new science lab. Wow, Sophie said, impressed. Then she gave her father a sly look. Does she like you, Dad? Like you? Michael laughed, feeling a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying lift slightly from his shoulders. You know what? I think she might. As they walked hand in hand to the parking lot, Michael thought about courage, not the dramatic kind from movies, but the quiet, everyday courage of standing up for what's right, of admitting when you're wrong, of opening yourself to new possibilities after loss. The kind of courage that changed lives not in an instant, but day by day, choice by choice. Sometimes all it took was one person willing to stand tall.